All right, folks, this is going to be an impromptu debate between the scientist Sam versus myself. This was, like I said, impromptu, unplanned, but we thought it was the most conducive for the both of us to do it this way. So let's get started. I would just start by asking you, why do you support the pro-choice position?
Well, there was ultimately, I can give you the short version of sort of what my stance is.
Hmm.
Um, because what convinced me was an argument by Judith Jarvis Thompson that
Oh,
I learned about
yes.
in college. But that was ultimately like that really why I really solidified that position. But to be honest, I mean, I'm sure similar to you, when I grew up religious, I grew up Jewish, and the fetus is not considered a person
Right.
under Judaism. So, under certain traditions, which is most of them. And so I
Hmm.
actually never grew up with any sort of uh, upbringing religiously that would convince me really one way or the other. We just didn't talk about abortion. So the short and sweet version of why I took my stance is because of Judith Jarvis Thompson and her argument. And
Yes.
the long version is I just kind of never bought into it and got my stance solidified by
Okay.
those arguments, at least.
Well, let's talk about that because I'm actually familiar with Thompson's argument.
What problem do you have? I mean, do you want me to explain it or like to the audience
Um,
so that they know?
sure, if you want, go ahead. I think that would
Sure.
be the best way to go about it.
So the analogy is that a woman goes to a concert, and she knows that by danger of going to the concert, that a violinist could attach himself to her and use her as life support because he has a fatal disease and he needs life support. And he can do this for 9 months. He has tubes connected. He's completely dependent on the woman. She has physical needs. And you would say that, oh, this person doesn't have a right to use the woman's body as a life support. It's ultimately it's the woman's choice over whether she controls her body or not. Um, so she can get rid of the violinist. Now, in this analogy,
Hmm.
the violinist, well, I should say the violinist is the child, and the mother
Hmm.
is the woman who went to the concert.
Hmm.
Yeah, and that's basically, I mean, that analogy basically solidified it that really what is at stake in an abortion morally is the ability of a mother to control her own body. It's actually morally irrelevant to me whether it's a potential human or a real human.
Right. So your position is even if you assume the humanity and the personhood and all that stuff for the sake of argument, at the end of the day, it's still her decision, right?
Yes, yes, because I see no difference between a even if I didn't see a difference between a fully developed woman or a human being, I should say, and a fetus. I would still say it's the woman's choice to control her own body. But I also don't believe that fetuses are persons by any means. That's
Right.
kind of a separate argument that
Right. Your actual position is that they're not persons or human beings or any of that jazz, but just even if you were to concede, like for the sake of argument, your position would still work. That's what you're saying?
yes, like my position still works even if you consider uh, the the fetus a full blown human life.
Sure. So I would say the first problem like really jumps right out at me. Like in Thompson's argument, like she said that she has a right to disconnect herself from the violence violinist. Like the violinist has no right, or she has no obligation to be connected to the violinist for 9 months. Now, the overwhelming majority of abortion procedures, if not all of them, because I haven't heard of one of them, which were like mere disconnection. You see, um, I've never heard of a single abortion procedure where the deliberate killing of the unborn wasn't done. Like taking surgical instruments and literally surgically cutting up the unborn in the womb. So if the scenarios were really the same, then it would be more like saying that the woman could literally like take a gun and then shoot the violinist to death, rather than just simply disconnecting herself and the violinist passively dying away.
Well, this is actually very interesting because in some of the follow-ups to the Jarvis Thompson, argument, which the violinist argument, of course, it was hotly debated. One of the main objections was that the way that we perform abortions, actually, that is not a fair analogy. That's a disanalogy, and there might be actually some merit to that. The only difference is, well, we can talk about when a woman has a choice to ingest, a pill or whatever treatment to get an abortion, and we know that chemical abortions are the most common. And surgical abortions, and I hope I'm not going to offend anyone, but typically what they do is they give where it needs to be surgical, they give the fetus a knock on the head, and that just collapses the skull, so it's easier to pass through the woman. Now let's say that we change that surgery to where the fetus is just the link is broken, and you just allow the fetus to live in the free air.
Right.
The fetus is that what you're arguing for would actually be a change in abortion procedure, which even still would be a minuscule rarity because the vast majority of abortions are chemical.
Right. So basically, you're saying that if we were to tweak the scenario a little bit and basically separate the unborn from the mother's womb without the act of killing, and the unborn now born were to passively die away, then that would totally satisfy the objection I gave, correct?
Yeah, that would.
All right. Well, here's the issue with this, because if the issue is about mere abandonment, then how far do we take this? Because we could say that, well, let's say you have a newborn child, right? And the parent or parents did not want to raise that child. Now, they don't actively kill the child, but they do something like, let's say, leave the child in the middle of nowhere. They didn't actively kill the kid, but they just left the child in the middle of nowhere, let's say like in the middle of the desert. Now, whatever happens to that kid afterwards is not their problem. So if you're going to say that like mere separation is okay, if you're going to make that argument, then why wouldn't mere separation in the state of leaving a newborn baby in the middle of nowhere not also be okay?
Well, here's the thing, though. What I would counter that by saying is that what I meant by, let the baby live, you can try to keep the baby alive, right?
Mm-hmm.
Treat it like a live birth almost.
Mm-hmm.
You can try to keep the baby alive, but we're still talking that, pretty much all of these babies, we're talking 99%. I can actually pull up the statistics. I have them in front of me, in fact. And you're talking about about 97% of cases, right? These fetuses would be completely inviable. So again, like we can try to keep them alive, right? But
Mm-hmm.
by the same token, we can try to keep a terminal patient alive.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, you're just fighting death.
Right.
So I would say that again, we just have to amend the abortion procedure. And God, sorry, I'm tired. I'm trying to
That's
think.
all good.
You would change the abortion procedure again so that for those that you try to keep and you try to keep the baby alive.
Mm-hmm.
That's I'm actually fine with that. That's a fine concession. But
Right.
even in that case, it doesn't make a difference, right? Like then
Right.
your objection again would be resolved because we did it. And by the way, this more what you're suggesting actually in some way more represents how we treat children, right? Once they're born and they can survive on their own, if the
Mm-hmm.
people have an obligation to that child, otherwise they surrender that child's rights to the state. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that makes sense. We're providing reasonable assurance of survival for a citizen. So,
Mm-hmm.
which
Well,
again, you could just take down to other specific rights that we get by age. So,
all right. Now here's what I would ask you. If your scenario is going to mirror the one in Thompson's scenario, because the violinist that's connected to you, or yeah, the violinist that's connected to you, that's a stranger relationship. Now, if the argument is going to be directly analogous, then who says that we need to treat this parent-child relationship like that? Who says we can't treat it like a stranger relationship? Who says that we have to keep this child alive? Who says?
well, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
You know that there was a case of a woman in Japan who uh, she was accidentally implanted in a fertility clinic with someone else's eggs, some other couple's eggs and sperm. So she
Okay.
literally had no relationship biologically to this
Right.
child.
Right.
Is it then okay for her to abort because she doesn't have the obligation of a mother and child?
Well, I would say that uh, no. Could you say that again? Let me make sure I understand. Say it again.
Well, there was a woman in Japan who, due to a fertility clinic mix up, she ended up being pregnant with her and her significant other ended up being pregnant with some other couple's child biologically. So
Mm-hmm.
then because that's not a mother-child relationship, does the mother then have to you know or I should say, is she then allowed to abort, or is it because there's no mother-child relationship?
Well, if you're talking about intentional killing, I'd say no. If you're talking about
Well, let's Antonio, let's just assume something that I already conceded, that
right,
all abortions are not intentional killings. They're
right,
I mean, and also we know that even if I didn't agree with you, we're talking about 99% of abortions here that
mm-hmm,
wouldn't involve that. So let's assume that I'm not okay with intentional killing, which I'm not. Let's try to assume in good faith that I'm not. So go to that
mm-hmm,
case first.
mm-hmm. All right, and then I would say this. I think uh, in that particular instance, like you said, that we would assume the obligation of like that child. Like if this is a stranger relationship, then in that particular case, I think the state will have an obligation to make sure that child is alive, but she wouldn't have an obligation to that kid.
But here's the thing:
Mm-hmm.
we just we just went through this though. Like
Mm-hmm.
if she's just getting rid of if she's just passively getting rid of this, What is
Right.
the difference between that, her doing that, and someone who's genetically related doing that? Because it's the
Right.
exact same procedure.
Right. So if everything is a stranger relationship. Now, here's the thing. Um, let's say we treat every single case like a stranger relationship.
Well,
Then
unless you can argue that that's not a meaningful distinct, that that's
right.
somehow a meaningful distinction morally.
I would say it is very meaningful, but let's just say that we treat every case like a stranger relationship. Like the parent child, we treat that like a stranger relationship. And in the case you gave, it's obviously a stranger relationship. Now, if we treat all cases like a stranger relationship, then I would ask, where do we really draw the line? Do we
Well, first off, I don't believe that the fundamentals of the case don't really change, right? So it's not that I don't value stranger like family relationships or anything like that, or I don't think that in some ways they are a really good thing.
Mhm.
Meaningful moral distinction you can make in this scenario, because like either like what is substantially the big difference between a fertilized embryo that is inside of a woman that has half her DNA versus unrelated DNA? What
Mhm.
exactly is the difference there morally?
What do you mean, just a fertilized embryo? I mean, um,
Well, I mean,
I'm
it
I'm
doesn't
not
matter,
sure
right?
what.
It doesn't matter by stage, right? So what
Well,
exactly is the dimension that makes it different for a fetus, right? For a bunch of
well, I guess
cells.
a bunch of cells. I don't even know what you mean by that because we're all or technically a bunch of cells. I mean, you got to be
I
more
mean,
specific than that.
you know what I'm. Well, no, I'm just saying when it's not a complete person.
What do you mean a complete person? What does that even mean? You seem to be begging the question.
Well, by a complete person, I mean an autonomous human being.
Well, who says autonomy defines personhood? Again, you're
I
begging the
didn't say
question.
that, but that's what I mean by it.
But I'm just saying, who says that though? I mean, you just
I mean,
started.
I'm saying it right now. If you don't agree with that definition, then I can explain what exactly I mean.
Oh, okay.
I would just hope for a charitable conversation here.
What I'm saying is, let's say that we treat every single case of pregnancy like a stranger relationship. If you're going to use that case in Japan, and you said there's not a really meaningful distinction, then I will ask you, then where do we draw the line? Do we just treat all cases of unborns like stranger relationships, or do we at some point say, okay, um, this is an entity that clearly had no uh, uh, part in its conception, and I'm not sure if you can treat that on the same level as, say, an adult,
Well, I
because
don't see. I'm kind of confused as to, and like I said, I'm tired, but I'm kind of confused as
mhm.
to where those somehow are directly connected, right? Like you
Well,
seem to have said a couple of different things there. So can I? I might ask you to just slow it down here. So,
here's
what do you like? What problem exactly do you have with us doing it in a stranger scenario, or are you okay with that?
well, here's the issue because I think there's a clear difference between a stranger relationship as opposed to a mother child relationship or a parent child relationship. Now, even if I were to concede for the sake of argument that in that case of the woman in Japan being implanted with someone else's baby, then how would that case all of a sudden justify the same thing for a parent child relationship? Because even if you were to say separation is justified in that case, that does not necessitate that, a parent-child relationship works the same way.
Well, are you trying to ask how does this not equate to, parents not engaging properly in the parent-child relationship
Yeah.
as like older children, I'm supposing?
What I'm
Is that
saying
what you
is,
mean? Because I'm very confused.
oh,
Because
okay.
you've kind of morphed from a couple scenarios, but do you just mean like what's the difference between a mother abandoning a stranger when they're 15 versus when they're 10 weeks old? Is that what you're
Well,
asking?
well, what I'm saying is, if the scenario you gave for Thompson's experiment like matches directly, then that would make the parent-child relationship into a stranger relationship. But the whole dynamic changes if you look at it from a parent-child relationship. You see what I mean?
I don't. Yeah, I kind of I understand, but what's the distinction between a parent child, excuse me, and a person and just a stranger
Oh,
relationship?
the distinction
Yeah, you
is
need to. I
we.
mean, you need to actually draw a distinction there.
Well, the
Because you
distinction
just
is
granted me, I'm just letting you know because what you just granted me, but for sake of argument, would require that.
right. The distinction would be that there would be a more obligation for the parent-child relationship to um, see to the well-being of that child. That would be the distinction. You can maybe argue that there is no such distinction with a stranger relationship, but there is definitely a more obligation if you're talking about a parent-child relationship. That there's a more obligation for the parent to see to the well-being of their child,
Yeah, but
especially.
why does that occur rather than valuing a stranger that much? What is so different about a stranger and someone's child?
Well, because look,
And that's what I'm
like
asking. Like
when.
I'm just telling you right now. That's the crux. Like if you can answer that successfully and convince me, then I'm going to concede that objection is valid.
Right. Now, for example, there would be an obligation for me. Let's say a woman has
But
a
what gives?
newborn.
What
Well, hold
really?
on. I'm trying
Well,
to
well,
answer
you're
you.
not. I mean, you're kind of repeating yourself, and
But you didn't let me finish, sir.
but no, because
You
you're
can't.
assuming
So you can't cut in on me. I was trying to answer you, and you cut
you
in.
were. I'm okay. I'm just trying to help you. Go ahead.
Well, if you let me answer, I will try to give that distinction that you're looking for, or the
Well, I, I'm
answer
just
that you
I'm just
wanted.
asking for you to be a little bit more direct with it because
I'm.
when you just
Well, will you let me answer you?
okay, then go ahead.
Now, look, if a mother has a newborn child, there's obviously an obligation there. But if that same woman, let's say, finds a an infant, all right, she has no obligation to take care of that infant. That's the difference. That's not her biological child, just some random infant.
She does have an obligation. She has to turn it into the state.
Well, she
Like if you just
definitely.
abandon an infant, you knowingly abandon an infant without putting it in a zone for adoption. You are morally and criminally in the wrong there. So I completely agree with that.
So you telling me that if I am in if like I am in my yard and like my child goes out into the street, it gets hit by a car, that's the same thing as if the neighbor's child is right next door, and and their child goes out into the street and gets hit by a car. That I would be morally culpable for trying to stop that kid from getting hit by the car.
No, like all I'm saying is that when you abandon a child, you're not supposed to abandon a child, because as a citizen, they, as a human being in the country, they have a right to their state obligations, which includes keeping them alive.
All right, but even if I concede that particular point, what about the point I just gave you? Would I have the same culpability to make sure my own child doesn't get hit by a car as opposed to the neighbors?
Well, so if it's your child, yes, you have a direct, you have a direct responsibility, especially because that child is considered, your ward, right? You're taking responsibility for the child, so it would imply a greater amount of, responsibility, but you're still obligated to help, a child who's in danger, uh, even if they're not related to you.
Because here's the thing: if get if I try to help my child and the child dies, I'm going to be well, not morally, but legally responsible. If I try to help the neighbor's child from getting hit by a car, even if I do not succeed, I will have no legal responsibility. It would be the
You
neighbor's
still wouldn't.
responsibility.
If you just sat and watched the kid die, you could be charged with criminal indifference.
And where does
So,
it say that at? Where does it say that at?
I mean, I don't know, but I can refer you to my cousin who was a district attorney in New York.
So
I mean, like I know I've asked him about this type of stuff before, just adoption law and that kind of stuff.
But
But
that's
to my knowledge,
but
it's like, if you are just criminally neglecting a child, that's a punishable offense.
so if I just if what if I was not able to do anything at all, and I just saw the child get and I tried to. I mean, how would they even be able to measure if I tried to help the child at all? How would they measure that? Like, how would they be able to see that I tried to do something to get that child out the way? How would they even know
Let's say
that?
that, I mean, you have to, I mean, the same way that you know anything, right? Like, you have to investigate and look at if there's evidence. I'm not saying it's not a difficult crime to either make a moral judgment on or to convict. There are plenty of difficult crimes to be convicted of. But again, like, there's some minimal obligation that we have to each other as
Right,
citizens.
right.
So,
I mean, but if you're going to argue that there's a minimal obligation there, then why wouldn't it be just as much a minimal obligation for the stranger woman in Japan?
well, yeah. So the reasonable obligation would be that you are doing the same thing in an abortion that a mother and her child would do, right?
Because if
It's the same as adoption, right? You're just you're giving someone away, right? So let's say that you're deciding to not be with this child, you're deciding for adoption, so you treat it, such that if it has its own body to be separated from the mother, you separate them, you try to keep it alive as much as you can, and then it dies.
But here's the thing: you're not doing whatever you can to save that child. You intentionally putting that child into a position to where it's less likely to survive. So never mind the fact that this entity would need like someone's direct biological body to survive. And if you separate them, you're not you're not doing anything at all to not anything at all, but you are putting that particular entity in the least possible probability of survival by removing it outside the womb. So it's basically like you're saying.
You could look for a womb donor.
So it's basically like you're saying that you're trying to help it, but you're not really helping it at the same time.
Well, you can, volunteer to have, a womb donor, have the fetus implanted into them.
Mm-hmm.
That ups the chances. I mean, that's the best expectation that you have, because if they're two separate people, one doesn't need to use the other for its body. Isn't obligated to let someone else use its body.
But here's what it comes down to right here is that when does a parent have an obligation to the well-being of their child? When do they?
Well, technically, it's defined currently once the child's born.
Mm-hmm. And that's only because we subjectively allow that. That's not because of any sort of logical principle. That's only because we make that standard of that. Now, if we were to say, like, look, for the sake of argument, if we were to say, like, well, not even a biological parent has any obligation to the well-being of their offspring, even when they are born, then it would not matter.
I just said that they have an obligation, right? The obligation is to assure the best chance of survival, or some chance of survival, as an autonomous being.
Sure, according to the government, maybe according to the government, but not by principle.
Well, no, we don't do that. No, Antonio, you agreed earlier that that's fine, that this would be fine with you, right? Is that instead we do that rather than, when we do a surgical abortion, intentionally, killing the fetus before it just dies on its own. I said if they made an attempt to keep the fetus alive and then it eventually died, that would be the proper correction that you'd be okay with. I already said that people have obligations to each other.
But if you were to say that there were two ways to two ways to keep somebody alive, then why in the world would you intentionally put them in the least possible condition to keep them alive?
Well, we just said that, well, it's less possible, but we could have a womb donor, for instance. Like, you don't see a lot of pro-life women volunteering to have fetuses transplanted into them.
I mean, I don't know why I don't know their personal reasons, and I don't try to presume that. But I mean, the important
they have a moral obligation to keep that child alive, no?
No, the parent does, but
what's different? But
the parent rejects that obligation though, because they think that the child is an impediment upon their personal autonomy.
Women have different reasons for abortions, but no, the meaningful thing here is that you need to actually demonstrate how I'm not meeting the requirement, right? They're two autonomous human beings. You've already, conceded the basic logic of the violinist argument, which would imply that, it's the same situation as the violinist. You would just detach them and provide them whatever you could to allow them to survive.
No, I didn't concede that we had to do anything. I mean,
we don't have to.
I didn't
you're saying
concede that.
assurance.
Hold on. I didn't
concede. Right?
I didn't concede that once separation happens, that we necessarily would have an obligation to do anything to keep that entity alive. We could just set.
So if a couple doesn't want a child, you're fine with them throwing it in a dumpster.
Say what?
Well, I'm saying the same basic thing, like as that, right? If you don't want your child, give it up for adoption. You're providing a reasonable situation where it can survive.
What I'm trying to get at is who says that just like the argument that there is no obligation in the if you use the logic in Thompson's thought experiment, and we were to suppose there is no obligation for the I'm not going to even say the parent.
But I don't suppose that there's no obligation.
But here's the thing. Then you are adding.
I suppose a moral obligation.
Yeah,
said that.
Yeah, you are adding extra things that did not exist in Thompson's argument. And what I'm getting at is
all consistent with Tom. For me to concede that, you actually have to demonstrate an inconsistency in my stance. Like
I'm not saying I never said you were inconsistent. I never said you were inconsistent. What I am saying is that for you to suppose that there is some sort of obligation, if you're going to treat
I am supposing that there's a moral obligation that the woman has to the violinist. In fact, she has
no obligation to keep that violinist alive once she says
so you don't believe in keeping your fellow citizen, trying to put efforts into keeping your fellow citizens alive.
Not that I don't believe in it. I'm just saying there's no moral obligation for that person to do so.
Do you believe that there's a moral obligation for someone to help strangers reasonably?
I would say sure.
Okay, then I'm just suggesting that.
I'm just saying that
you can't just dismiss when I concede a point, right? Like, you can't just dismiss when I highlight a point and then move, and you don't address it as if I just said that thing, right? I've said that there's a moral obligation there. I'm just requesting that it's the same obligation.
Well, I'm just asking you, why do you suggest that there should be one?
Because we live in a society. And because we live in a society, we have responsibilities to other people in the society because it helps us flourish.
But who's to say that it's not more moral to basically say, you know what, I may not want to be pregnant at this time, but that is the absolute best chance this entity will have to survive. So I'm going to take the maximal possibility option of that person surviving. That would be a lot more moral to do, to have sort of a self-sacrifice to your personal convenience. So who says that we shouldn't do it that way rather than just separate and have a less chance and then basically try to say I'm still being moral?
I'm sorry, my internet kind of crapped out in the middle of what you were saying, so I feel bad.
Oh, it's all good, man.
Asking you to repeat.
I'm just saying that, like, who's to say that it would not be even more moral for the person to say, you know what, although my personal discomfort, would be, it would be my personal discomfort, I would be inconvenienced, but if I just sacrifice my personal comfort to ensure the maximal chance that this person, my fellow man, lives, then I bite the bullet and allow this person to be connected to me. Who says that's not even more moral to do rather than disconnection and putting your fellow human being into a less maximal possibility to live? If you really care about your fellow human being, who is to suggest that it would not be even more moral to have a self-sacrifice for your personal convenience to help your fellow human being?
Okay, well, the thing would be is that you're you're confusing moral worth with moral obligation. So it might be praiseworthy to go to that length. It would be certainly praiseworthy. It wouldn't necessarily entail that you need to do it, that it's an obligation. It's sort of like extra, right? You have the cash to pay your bills, and then you have the extra cash that makes you richer. I'm suggesting this is like the extra cash. So yeah, they'd be incredible human beings, and I'd even praise them. But that doesn't mean that I would have the same. I wouldn't have an obligation to do the same because they don't have an obligation to do it. It's just something awesome that they do.
Right, but you can make that same argument for standing by them even when you disconnect them, like basically doing whatever you can to help your fellow human being after you disconnected. While that may be praiseworthy to do, there is no obligation that you should have to do so.
Well, no, I mean, you would need to give it a chance to survive. So that is an obligation, or some reasonable chance at surviving as its own autonomous entity.
Well, maybe someone else, but who says it has to be you?
No, that's part of that's part of your responsibility because you're the one making the choice on this action.
So basically,
it's a woman making the choice, so she's the person who would have that choice, right?
So right. So basically, you're telling me that if you're like the violinist who got thrown into a situation with a total stranger, if you got put into that situation by not a choice of your own, then you are obligated to that stranger when that person disconnect from you, even though you did not ask to be in that situation. You telling me that once you disconnect the stranger from you, because you didn't ask to be in that situation, you would still have an obligation to that stranger even afterwards to try to help them survive.
Yes. Oh, so you're saying that you're okay with abortion in the case of rape?
Say what?
What you just said implies that you're okay with abortion in the case of rape, right? Because the woman is attached to the violinist against her will without anything to do with her actions.
Okay, so this goes back to
That's correct.
Implying. That's correct.
So you're okay with abortion in the case of rape.
But here's the.
Can you give me a yes or no on that one?
Say what?
Are you or are you not okay with abortion in the case of rape? Right.
No.
If so, you're not okay. Then wouldn't you argue that that's the equivalent of a woman being the equivalent of a woman being raped is that the violinist is forced upon her without any having nothing to do with her fault.
All that would do at best is justify abortion in the case of rape. It would not justify abortion for the sole sake of convenience. That's
right.
all it would do.
The original version of okay, so do you agree then? So you still think that even if the woman's raped, she still has that she would even though she was forced on her against her will and having nothing to do with her choice by the violinist, that's the equivalent. That's the equivalent if she gets raped.
I'm well aware. I'm well aware that the violinist argument. I've looked at this argument many times, and all it does is justify abortion in the case of rape. It doesn't justify abortion outside of that.
If you've read it many times, have you read her original essay?
Say what?
Well, you've said you've read this argument many times. Have you read her initial essay? The essay she published to the philosophical literature?
Um, I'm not. I'm not. I wasn't aware. I'm not aware that there was more than one version of this. I only read
Well, no,
one version of
did
this.
you, I mean, the one that she actually authored. Have you read that version? Like the one that she put into a philosophical journal?
I'm not sure which one that would be referring to, so I couldn't tell you if it was
It's the
the.
only version. It's the one that's authored by her, by Judith Jarvis Thompson.
Well, the
Have you
only
read
one
the
that
one by her?
the
I'm just
only
asking simply if
right,
you've read the one by her.
the only
I'm not trying to score a point here. I'm just asking.
I get that, but the only one that I've ever read by her at best justifies abortion in the case of rape. The only one
Well,
that
then
I
I have to
recall.
say you didn't read it you didn't read it
What?
correctly,
So
right? Like
what
she could
other
have known
criteria?
she
What other
she could have
criteria?
known, hey, I'm in the middle of a sentence.
All
She
right, go
could
ahead.
know she could know that, there was a non-zero risk of what was I saying? A non-zero risk that by going to a concert, she knows there's a risk that
Mm-hmm.
she could be, hooked up to a violinist. And she could
Mm-hmm.
imagine a variety of scenarios where she knows the risk. In all
Mm-hmm.
of those scenarios where she knows that that's a possibility, we're talking about, whether even she wants it at one point,
Mm-hmm.
but then she decides, oh no, like I can't do this. I can't live this way.
Mm-hmm.
In all of those cases, she still has the right to remove the violinist from her body. And I think you would agree to that.
But even if she knows that there's the risk, that still is rape. That still would be
That's not
connected to
rape.
rape, even if she did know the risk of something like that happening, and it
No, no.
happened and it happened at her inconvenience, like rape, for example. No matter how you slice it, it's
Uh,
still comparable to
Antonio,
rape.
you're making a distinction without a difference. I'm
Well, that's
agreeing to
no
that.
real
In any
difference.
behavior, there is a risk for a woman to get pregnant, right? So it's the same situation.
So
But
you telling me that a woman having consensual sex, knowing the risk, and then pregnancy happening is the same as some dude forcing his will upon her where she didn't have sex.
that's not what I'm saying.
Not didn't have sex, but him penetrating himself into her and getting pregnant. That's the same thing
No,
as
that's
her
not what I'm
having.
saying.
Okay, then
Okay,
what are
wait,
you
Antonio,
saying?
that's not what I'm saying, and I'm kind of starting to get impatient what
What
I'm
are you
saying.
saying? What are
Well,
you saying? Make
well,
your point, sir.
try, please try harder with listening because I'm trying to make this clear.
Well, I'm
A
sorry, you do
scenario,
sound unclear, sir.
God damn it. In any scenario that a woman undergoes where there is some measure of risk of pregnancy just by going out in public, by the same
Mm-hmm.
token, the woman knows that in a variety of scenarios, it's more and less risky regarding getting, hooked up to the violinist to the point
Mm-hmm.
where, and I would extend it, even if she wants to get hooked up, I think she has some more obligations than if she didn't. But even if she knows that there's a high level of risk that this could happen, she still wouldn't be, morally obligated. Still wouldn't be her fault. Or, it would be partially her fault due to her actions, but she wouldn't have some strange moral obligation if that's not what she wanted. So at the very least, this is with unwanted children because there's always a risk of getting pregnant.
So, so basically, a woman can have consensual sex all she wants, right? And not even care about the risk that her actions could lead to that particular condition of pregnancy. But you're going to put that in the same ballpark as a rapist who penetrated her.
In the sense that, is it her fault?
Yes, it is her fault.
In either scenario, it's her fault for going. In the sense that
No,
there's
it's
a
not her
chance that it
fault.
could happen.
It's not
Well,
her fault in
either it
rape.
is
It's
or it
not her
isn't.
fault.
Either
It's
it
not
is
her
or it isn't.
fault. It's not her fault in rape, but it is her fault in consensual sex.
Why? What if she took all of the precautions she could have possibly taken?
So what? If she take all of the precautions, that's still her knowingly engaging in sex with knowing the potential she could get pregnant, and that's clearly not the same as her being penetrated. So even if she took every precaution, that's still not the same thing. Because here's the thing: she could get, like, let's say, I don't know, a total hysterectomy and not get pregnant at all. But if she
Well,
refuses
here's the
to
thing. Here's the
exercise her
thing,
maximal
Antonio.
if she refuses to exercise her maximal options to avoid getting pregnant 100%, in no case can you compare that to her being forcibly penetrated.
Well, there's a risk of her getting raped just by participating in society, right? Like, this can be verified, right? If you saw that some college girl got, date raped in a dorm, that was operated by a frat, or I should, not a dorm, a frat house, right? When she went to a highly risky area,
Mm-hmm.
but she still got raped. It's not her fault, right? She doesn't have some
Right.
strange moral obligation, right? It's
Right.
not her fault. She knows that there's a chance, but she's preparing the best that she can to
It
not get
does.
raped. But things happen, right? It's the
It
same as consensual. This is the same as consensual sex with a condom. It's just that it's a more, it's more risky with respect
it
to the goal of getting pregnant, of
it,
not
do-
getting pregnant.
it doesn't matter the level of risk she puts herself in if she gets forcibly penetrated. It does matter what risk she puts herself in if rape has nothing to do with how she got pregnant.
Why?
Say what?
Why? Because I mean, would you agree that
Because
like
a woman being
the
promiscuous,
scenario,
a woman.
the
Wait, hold
scenario,
on.
like there's
I'm
no
answering you. A woman being promiscuous, like for example, is in no ballpark the same as a woman who got raped. No
both of them could
sense.
have taken precautions for their behaviors, right? Like the promiscuous woman could use protection or only have one partner, but a rape victim could just, you could say, oh, they could have not gone out of the house, right? Because that's a way to reduce rape. People don't get, if they don't go out, they typically don't get raped.
So
So
basically,
even in the case, I'm not saying that you know, that it's her fault. Like in any scenario, I'm not saying it's her fault if she gets raped. By the same token, it's not their fault that they got pregnant. Because if they're taking reasonable precautions in whatever scenario, they have to know that they're presuming more or less of a risk.
that would be like saying that I'm drinking and driving and not getting a car, and then I get in a car accident, knowing the risk behind that. But it's the same thing as taking risks just to drive, period, and then someone else crashes into me.
In terms of what?
If if you are drinking and driving, right, and you know that there's a risk behind that, that's clearly different than you not drinking and driving at all, but you knowing the risk of driving and you're sober and you're driving the car and then somebody plows into you. You know those risks are different.
Yes, I do know that the risks are different, and I didn't say that I didn't. What I'm saying is that at no point have you entered a scenario where, other than, and I'll say that it's kind of gray with, a woman who wanted to be connected to the violinist. But other than that, you can put yourself in situations where you're very, very likely to get hooked up to a violinist. You still would have no moral obligation. It's the same thing. This applies to all unwanted pregnancies.
But here's the issue I have with what you're saying. You seem to think that the only moral obligation there is after the disconnection. During the disconnection, there is no moral obligation, but after the disconnection, there is. But you want to talk about them
Yes.
being autonomous beings, but you want to talk about them being autonomous beings, and
Antonio, can I
without
stop you for
telling,
1 second?
no, hold
Well,
on,
the problem is that you just
hold on. No,
you
wait, no,
just
no, no. You didn't let me finish. Let me
but
finish. You
you
want to
okay,
talk? No,
first
dude,
off,
stop. Let
Antonio,
me finish. Quit interrupting me.
you've
What?
interrupted me twice, Antonio,
You've been
since
interrupting
the
me
last
more
time.
than that. You've been interrupting me more than that, sir.
I stopped interrupting you, and since the last time that I interrupted you before this
Dude,
time, you've
dude,
interrupted me twice. So
dude,
we can
dude,
argue about this, but Antonio,
dude,
I don't
dude.
want to
You know what, man? You know what, man? This is going nowhere. It's
well, yeah,
clearly
you're
going
not
nowhere.
listening to what I have to say.
Now,
I
and
mean,
almost every time I'm trying to make a point, you keep on
I
interrupting me.
didn't you've interrupted me more since the last time before this current interruption. So you can't complain about that. I'm
All
not
right.
complaining about
You
it.
know, let's try to get back on track. How about that? Is that
Well,
fair to
I'm
you?
asking you to, yeah, well, I mean, you misstated my stance again. So like I'm getting the feeling you're either not listening to me or you're not able to retain what I'm saying. And if
All
you're
right,
not
start
listening to me,
over.
that sucks.
Start over. Start over. Don't patronize me, sir. If you are, start over.
I'm not patronizing you.
Okay, then
I have
start
no idea
over.
what the case is because either I'm
Dude,
not
just
being
start.
clear enough
Dude,
or
just
you're not
start
listening to
over.
me.
Dude, just start over. Then let's do.
Where do you want me to start over to?
Hmm. I really don't know, to be honest with you.
Well, I mean, I've already conceded that we do have moral obligations to strangers. I'm just suggesting that we do the exact same thing, which would be,
I'm
you
just.
would give up. I've said I've conceded that. Still
Mm-hmm,
doesn't interfere with my audit,
mm-hmm.
my argument. The woman can put her, unless she's intending to get pregnant, which I think is a different moral issue, unwanted pregnancy by, the violinist argument.
I'm just saying that the problem I have with your argument is that you seem to suggest that there's more of an obligation to a stranger once they're off your body than there is when they're on your body.
No, you've way more. So you don't have to ensure that the stranger has like as much of a chance to survive as you would for a child because a child's more at more at risk. Like an undeveloped fetus is more at risk. So you take different measures to make it survive, but you're still giving it a chance to survive. It's the same treatment.
But that's just like saying that a child who can't care for themselves is has the obligation to be taken care of by someone else, as opposed to that child growing up to be a fully able-bodied adult, being more able-bodied to care for themselves, and then there's still someone else be obligated to take care of their needs. What I'm saying is they become more independent at that particular point. So why should anybody be obligated to take care of them when they're more independent? And when that person is separated from your body, they are um, they are basically separated from you. You
I
at
know
the,
what it means, Antonio.
okay.
Um,
All right, cool. You do? All
yeah.
right.
Um, well, you can just change how deathly ill is the violinist. Is it the second that you get rid of him, he's gonna die, or he'll survive for a little bit, but then you know, he'll die. Um, these you can just do this with how sick is the violinist, right? Like, what if the violinist, would survive, only for, you know, 4 seconds or something.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you can argue as to where that distinction would be. still, I mean, you're giving the fetus some possibility that as an autonomous being, that's the key part here, as an autonomous being, it can survive. As long as you're giving reasonable recourse to that, I mean, it's the exact same, because you can just vary how sick the violinist is and how long they will survive without the connection.
So here's what would have to happen. If I were to agree to your argument for the sake of it, here's what would have to happen. We would have to basically implement all sorts of medical technology in order to allow that separation for that entity to survive. That's what would have to happen in the real world. But we don't have any such technology like that in the real world. So basically, if most abortions are happening in the first trimester or so, then there is absolutely no possible chance that the separation will entail that even if you were to do anything, that human is not going to survive. At least in the example that you gave with Thompson's argument, you're dealing with someone who's a lot more developed, who's more able to survive at that point. But in the earlier stage, there is no such possibility. And why would
I got you, Antonio. You're starting to repeat yourself. Sorry.
Here's why, and if we care about if we care about our fellow man so much, then why would we allow the separation early term to where we know that that entity is going to die?
Well, I mean, by the same token, you know, we still treat AIDS patients even when they're going to die.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We have some obligation if they want to, if they want to be, if they want to be saved, they can be saved.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can make that attempt, but we know that they're going to die, right? So that's the same thing. We still try to treat diseases, even though we know they're going to die. You're just saying our technology is not good enough. So then the answer would be, if you accept my argument, you should just be trying to raise money to develop the technology such that this is a possibility.
Well, that's not my position. That is your position, sir.
Well, you said for the sake of argument.
Right.
I'm saying I already said for the sake of argument.
Right.
Because you said that, right?
It would
So
only mean for the sake of argument, but I don't actually accept that.
Do you know what for the sake of?
Yes, I do, sir. I know. I'm well aware of what
all
that
I'm
means.
doing is saying that because you accepted that for the sake of argument, you would then, you would have this exact same. You'd accept this, right? You instead, what you would be arguing for is, hey, let's lobby for technology that better allows infants to survive outside of the womb. Well, I should say fetuses, not infants.
So basically, there's still the unresolved part here about you. For some reason, you think we have an obligation to help people who are attached to us, if they're disconnected from us. I still don't really understand where you get that from, other than you saying we should help our fellow human being.
Yeah, I think that's all you need, is we should help our fellow human being. I can get into reasons why I believe that, but I think that that's a reasonable standard.
So basically, I just don't see any necessity behind that. You really think that we have more of an obligation to help someone when they're off our body than they are when they're attached to us. Here's the thing.
No,
Because,
no, that's
because
not what I said. I said that you have a moral obligation in either case. How much obligation changes for different situations.
well, you literally have no obligation to help them once they're attached to your body.
No,
You
I
have
didn't
no
say that. I
say,
didn't say that.
why would you have any why would you have any obligation to them at all? The reason why women are legally able to get abortions is because the law um, allows them to do it. They have no obligation to the unborn. They can go to an abortion clinic and get an abortion. They have no obligation to keeping that child alive. None.
Well, I mean, you just shifted from our hypothetical scenario to the actual scenario. So which do you want me to address?
All right. So
Because you just completely shifted worlds here. I thought we were talking about, you know, what the moral thing is versus what's actually happening right now.
so
And
wait
I
a
can,
minute. So
and I
you
can
think
concede, for the sake of argument, that some of those things would need to change. I just suggested that we do as much as we can for these fetuses to survive.
well, we're not doing as much as we can if you are going to disattach them from the maximal possible chance to survive. You're not doing as much as you can.
Well, I said as much as you can once they're an autonomous human being.
And I just don't see any necessity as to why we should do that, other than you saying that we just should do it.
What do you mean? Like, I'm very confused now by what you're trying to argue.
Because you're just saying that, oh, they're even though we had no even though we have no obligation to them to keep them on our body, for some reason we have some obligation to them which comes out the ether somewhere, because you say we should care about our
No,
fellow
it's not
human
out of the
beings.
ether. It's not out of the ether. It's, you know, the basic obligation of, you know, how to treat your fellow man right.
Where does this basic obligation come from?
I mean, do you want to get into a discussion on where all morality comes from, or, you know, can we just say that that's where it morally comes from? I can go into the reasons why I believe it, but that's a different discussion.
Mm-hmm. Clearly it is. I think we're pretty much of an impasse here, honestly, man.
Well, I mean, Antonio, I mean this as a friendly bit of criticism, but the issue is, you know, you would concede certain parts of my argument, and then you would argue others, and then those would
Well,
conflict with each other. And so I kind of got the sense that you were not taking as much of an effort as you could to understand me, or was there a point where I was unclear?
no. Well, there were some points to where you seemed unclear. That's why I was saying that we should start over, because we clearly had a conflict, and I wanted to start all over again. And now that we have everything cleared up, I still don't understand you thinking that we have an obligation to help someone that's disconnected from us. I just don't
Do you
understand where you
believe that
borrow
we
that
have
from.
obligation? Do you believe that we have obligations to our fellow citizens?
In certain ways, yes, and others, no.
Okay, so do we have some obligation to take steps, you know, within reason to allow them to survive?
In cer- in what way? What do you mean?
Like, do you believe welfare is moral?
Well,
I'm, I'm
that's
just I'm just saying, like, you find your, I mean, I'm just suggesting the moral equivalent. I can list this in 1,000 ways of, you find your neighbor passed out with a head wound in front of your house. You have an
mhm.
obligation to call for help. That's actually a legal obligation, because they're on your property and you have immediate access to it.
And what if they're not? Do you still have an obligation?
Well, obviously, you can't know, you know, if this has that this has happened, and you're not, aware of it, right? It's about awareness.
Hmm.
But the point
So if
would
you
be is,
see,
like, do you agree with me on that? Like, that we have some obligation to the people around us to ensure that they are alive and well.
I guess it would depend on the situation. On a
Well,
certain
just
level,
you don't think you're you should treat your neighbors well,
of
but
course.
I mean, then you have an obligation towards them, right? I'm asking you if
Hmm.
you, like me, believe that we have obligations to our fellow human beings.
Again, in some cases, yes, and in others, no.
Well, either we do or we don't. I mean, in what case? Like, what distinction are you making?
Like, for example, like, um, as if my neighbor gets into debt and I have the money to help them out of a really bad situation, I would say, who I would say that, yes, I guess, um, it would be a good thing to do to help them, but do I have more obligation to it would be a good thing to help them, right? But would you treat that as the same thing as like saving their life? Like I would say,
No,
like you
I,
have like
I
no obligation to help them in that situation. Although it would be a good thing to do, you really have no obligation to do so.
well, I already explained this distinction
Hmm.
earlier,
Right.
right? Between something that's praiseworthy and something that's an obligation. You just outlined
Hmm.
something that was praiseworthy, not something that's an obligation. I explained this half an hour ago.
But like I said though, if I don't see to where there's an obligation because like I said, if you see um you're
So you don't believe in, if they're, the father gets sent to death, the mother can't find a job, so she gets on welfare. Do you think that she's entitled to welfare?
do I think she's entitled to welfare?
Yeah.
Um if it, I think we are entitled on a certain level to help them like if it's
No, no, welfare, like the government, right?
mhm. I
You know
think
what welfare is.
if she's able by it, I say no. If she
Well, no,
can
let's
work
say
and do
that.
all that stuff, then I'd say no. If there's no way she can
Okay,
supply
let's say
for
that.
herself, then I'll say yes.
Well, yeah, I was gonna say, like, the important part is that she can't get work for whatever reason
Hmm.
that is, right? But it's the relevant reason. Well, that's the same thing, right? When we pay into welfare, the reason we pay into welfare is because we are, protected, because we find it moral to protect the well-being of others in our society,
Hmm.
right? So there's different levels of obligation for different situations. That doesn't mean that you don't have an obligation to other human beings. It's just that it's
Hmm.
different in every scenario, right?
Hmm.
Like a close friend of mine, I have different obligations because of the nature of that relationship than, a complete stranger. It's that's not you. You wouldn't call me immoral for that, right? So
Hmm.
we both agree there's some minimum level of obligation in all of these scenarios, so we should meet that obligation, and we can discuss what that obligation is in each scenario.
I would say on a certain level, yes. I still got a problem with your scenario because like if you were to say that you have an obligation to make sure that person is alive after you disconnected them, then what if what if let's say like that person where was I going with this? I lost my entire train of thought, man. I was going somewhere with this and I lost my entire train of thought. But
No worries. Well, I mean, again, this is where you get into the distinction between autonomous and non-autonomous people. Obviously, autonomous individuals, have the rights conferred to them by their autonomy. And so once they have been removed, they are autonomous individuals and they have whatever obligations, other people have to be kept alive.
well, here's the thing, and that would mean that what do you think of the organ donation argument that it said that we're not forced to donate our organs to someone who needs them, and in the same way, a woman should not be forced to allow her body to be used by the unborn. What do you think of that?
Um, I mean, I think they're related. So I would say, in some sense, they're equivalent.
So would you say that if you were the only person in the world who could help somebody survive, like you were the only person in the world who could donate that person a kidney, would you say that you have a more obligation to do so?
Um, I would personally do so, but I mean, again, you control what happens to your body before and after you die.
So
In the sense
you
that, in
so
the
it's a
sense that, let me clarify, in the sense that you have some ownership of it, you know, pending death, right? The same way that you have some ownership of money or something like that.
okay. So you would apply that pending death, but you wouldn't apply that while you're still alive, correct?
What do you mean?
Like
Like,
I'm not dead right now. I'm not dead right
live?
now, and then somebody needs my kidney to live, and let's say I'm for whatever reason I'm the only one who can help them. Would I have an obligation to give away my kidney to them right now?
No, but you would be praiseworthy for doing so.
Mm-hmm.
Because at the same time, you need to consider how much is that. I mean, it's not a clear issue because you have to determine whatever choice you make. You have to determine. You have to weigh. How bad. How wrong the violation of your bodily autonomy is versus how praiseworthy it is to save that person. I'm not saying that. Um, I'm not saying that this means that anytime someone's going to choose one thing or the over the other. What I'm saying is, though, is that choice is up to the individual, and if they decide they want to save that human being and they want to make every effort that they can, we praise them, but that doesn't mean that there's an obligation.
I would just say that I don't see any more obligation to give somebody your organ any more than I would see any such obligation to help somebody once they disconnected from your body.
Oh no, I agree that you don't have an obligation, and that's based on the fact that the violation of your autonomy is outweighs, the how morally pleasing it would be to to do so, right? Because it's not you don't have a moral obligation to do it. It's just it's praiseworthy.
Hmm.
So I agreed with you that you don't have an obligation, but you would be praiseworthy.
Well, you know what, man? I'm actually getting a little tired here. I appreciate this exchange, man, and I'm not going to lie. I think you're a very worthy opponent. I think you're probably the strongest one I've ever spoken to.
Well, I mean, I would say that don't view it as opponents. We're just people having a
Right.
conversation. I don't
Absolutely.
really like to enter formal debates because
Yeah.
you get it like honestly a lot of that was me just trying to get you to understand what I was saying, and sometimes when you
Hmm.
look at it as an opponent, um and I as guilty of this as anyone else.
Yeah, I
uh,
didn't mean to like see you as some adversary or anything like that. Dang, yeah,
oh yeah, it's no worries.
yeah.
And yeah,
Well,
just let me know anytime. I mean, I think we did cover some points. I probably conceded some points that I feel comfortable conceding, but
hmm,
most, not most, but a good portion of, pro-choice advocates would disagree with me on.
Yeah,
so this
I
is
would
a fun
say
conversation.
absolutely. I would say if anyone wants to argue their position in the most proper way possible, they need to talk to people like you because the overwhelming majority of the ones I come across just got terrible arguments. I think the ones you given were I'm ultimately not convinced, but I think they were a lot more well thought out and a lot more intelligible than the overwhelming majority I've heard. I will give you that.
Oh, thanks. I mean, I do happen to think that, a fetus doesn't qualify as a human life. And I think that those arguments
Right.
are very strong. But I think
Uh-huh.
that the bodily, this is just a much stronger argument because you're not arguing over something that really is far more contentious. Like when does,
Mm-hmm.
when is a person, right? Which
Right.
is endlessly, even, I think that you can make an easily convincible argument for not the first maybe 2 years. But once you
Mm-hmm.
get to that point, once you get to like a 1.5 or 2 year old, determining exactly when it becomes a person, I'm not able to.
Okay. Fair enough.
So,
Well,
yeah, so like I don't argue along those lines because one, there's a gray line, and um, two, I think it's more of a matter of choice.
oh, fair enough, man. Well, I appreciate you coming by, man.
No
Yeah,
problem.
and
I'm gonna take off. I'm a little tired, but thanks for having
yeah,
me in.
and I wish you the best in your training and your studies or whatever you're involved in, man.
Oh yeah, no problem.
All right, have a good night, man.